So I'm still trying to think a little bit more about the new media and what the implications of all these new technologies are. And it's just so many different thoughts. And some of them are precipitated by a recent video that Conference Report had posted up called We. And it was trying to, I guess, ask about different kinds of collectives or different orientations toward what people mean by a we, by a socially integrated sense of individuals and the different form that that can take. And, one of the ways maybe to compare it would be to set it up as a contrast between, I guess, these kind of military collectives where everyone is in uniform and people they give a kind of demonstration of their uniformity by by the uniforms they're in, and the sort of size as a demonstration of power. So it's like the aggregate itself gives, again, a kind of physical representation of the massiveness of the group, and it's meant to symbolically convey power and solidarity. But that seems so different than the kind of shifting amorphous function of anonymity, right? Where you could look at, something like this group anonymous, where, part of the way that the power is conveyed is, I guess, by a shifting sense of who's included and who's not, and a lack of definition on the perimeter, or a lack of clarity regarding where the borders are of who's in and who's out. And they do seem to be very, very different strategies. As much as I guess I was, partly thinking about that, what that means, there really are so many other issues that I think are related to it. It has to do with, again, what we mean by community and how community itself seems to be changing. It's as if the, and I think, I've talked about this before, that in some way you hear a lot of talk about these new media being technologies of connectivity and of networking, of bringing people into um, forms of relation with one another where previously they had been separated. And it's, I don't think that's really true. It seems to be more the case that there's a kind of internal diaspora, or a kind of geographical dispersion where people are um, isolated off and spread out throughout the country, partly due to, a need to get jobs. They need to, make a living for themselves. And so, people are now, they're more dislocated from friends and family and from local, hometown geography, more so than they have been in history. Certainly, maybe, after the Second World War, there was a great amount of international diaspora. But here, it's almost like diaspora is part of modernity. It's part of everyday individual life within the U.S. as people jockey for something like a better career, a better job, places that they're going to move for availability of resources. And so it's as if, to compensate for the increased sense of isolation, loneliness, the fact of being more disconnected than ever before, now we have these technologies that supposedly are keeping people connected. That they're a kind of recompense for the isolation, and then even there in how well they do keep people connected. I don't know. I mean, some people would say that they actually promote further isolation. They make people feel lonelier, even though they have readily available to them all kinds of information about what their friends are up to, but their friends are distant or too busy. They're too otherwise occupied by what they need to do. There does seem to be a sense in which it's, I think there's so much on it that brains are being rewired, and that there's a kind of chronic distraction that's going on. It's increasingly difficult for people to have a long sustained moment of thought. They're they're multitasking, and they're hopping from one thing to another, and a lot of it, I guess, was precast a long time ago. People should have seen it coming. The fact that many generations ago a person would sit around and listen to the radio while they would read the newspaper. This was just the beginning of multitasking. It was going to get much, much worse. People just didn't see that that was a kind of multitasking. I think part of it has to do with psychological differences in the texture or composition of the young people. So, and part of this, it's very ambiguous. Ellen Langer, who is a scholar at, I think she's at Harvard, but a psychologist, does a lot of really great work on mindfulness. She's got a couple books on mindfulness, but she has a bit of work on the mindless use of language, and she talks about how it's in attribution theory, or the actor-observer bias in psychology, but it's the way that, sometimes if something favorable occurs, we attribute it to, some characteristic of ourselves. If something unfavorable occurs, we say that it was situational, or something, some happenstance or some factor bore upon it. And then we do the exact opposite of that with other people. When something good happens to them, we say, well, it was luck. And when something bad happens, we say, well, it was some dispositional characteristic of the person. And what she does is she takes this actor-observer bias and talks about the way language itself smuggles in various kinds of biases in, I guess, the way that we talk about others. So if we like someone, we say that they're very flexible, where if we don't like them, we say that they're inconsistent. Now, on the other hand, if we like some person, we say that they're firm, right? And if we don't like them, we say that they're dogmatic or they're rigid. It's like the terms themselves, they carry a connotative value that it allows us to smuggle in a kind of an evaluation while seeming to just be descriptive. And I'm bringing this up, I guess it's sort of roundabout, but I think when I hear people talk about the youth of today, and I do hear a lot of this, they say, well, the youth of today, young people, this Generation Z or Generation Y or the net generation, there's all these different terms people will use. And they'll say that young people are interaction adverse, and they're such introverts, and they're too quiet, and they'll give all these terms. And okay, I can hear that. Another part of me wants to say, well, they're more introspective, they're more thoughtful, they're more self-conscious. They're not the big dumb puppy that leaps out into the crowd and starts just licking people the way that previous generations were, maybe. They're thrown back upon themselves with some forms. Certainly not, they're not, I guess, superiorly self-conscious. I think, they certainly have their blind spots in the way that every generation does. But I think it's just a mistake to just cut it one way or the other. Maybe part of the issue, it goes back to this original question that Fred was asking of, what is community? And is community real? Is it just an abstraction? I mean, are individuals the only thing that's real? Or are collectives real? And part of it, I think, comes from asking the question about quiddity. Okay, quiddity, this scholastic or medieval notion of whatness. That is, we say, well, what is something? Well, for the longest time, people thought that whatness came from the language of God or something, the words that Adam spoke to God, or that Adam used to name the things. And so etymology had a privileged position within ancient and scholastic thought, and people thought that you could get the true words for things, and if you get the true words for things, you get their whatness, their essence. And by the time the periodic chart of the elements hits the scene and it gets increasingly mapped out, the notion of whatness really it changes, and we end up saying that things that can't be found on the periodic chart of the elements, they're really not anything substantial or material. They're basically abstractions. They're ideas. They're things that people make up from forms of concepts and ideas. But what's interesting along the way there is that we seem not to notice the way that quiddity doesn't go away, it just changes. And that the periodic chart of the elements, it changes what we mean by what. And if we say, well, how did those changes occur? Well, it seems as if the communication technologies are what did it. In this case, it was numeracy, literacy, alphabetacy. It had to do with microscopy and the kinds of those communication technologies, they altered sensibilities and expectations, and I guess changed what we mean when we say what is something. And again, I'm bringing this up because I think that that's one of the ways to try to understand these new communication technologies is to say that they affect quiddity, that there is and the way to say it is this, that anything that isn't on the periodic chart of the elements, those things are going to be the most subject to changing and altering the whatness by various communication technologies. So, for example, the telephone, it changes what we mean by a conversation. It changes what we mean by distance. The television, it changes what we mean by entertainment. It changes what we mean by a politician. It changes what we mean by education. I mean, literacy changed what we mean by memory, what we mean by knowledge, what we mean by a citizen, what we mean by community. And it would seem that there are so many aspects of our world which they're real, they have a kind of essence, they're not subjective, so it's not a social constructionism. It's certainly not a postmodernism. It has to do with this issue of quiddity and how does quiddity take its form, its resonance, its shape from a given dominant communication technology, or once a communication technology hits the scene, how does it, in its form, affect what all kinds of other things are? That's really what I'm sort of interested in. I'd love to get some feedback from other people. Okay, thanks.